In a quiet, tree-lined suburb, a beloved mother was found murdered in her own home, leaving behind a devastated husband and a silent, traumatized 9-year-old daughter. With no forced entry, no robbery, and no apparent motive, the police investigation stalled, the case a baffling and tragic mystery. They had no leads, no suspects, and no idea that the only witness to the crime was the small, silent girl they had overlooked. A child who held a secret so terrible it would tear her family apart and expose a monster hiding in plain sight. Before I begin, thank you for watching. I'd love to know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. It means a lot to know you're here, sharing these stories with me. We're in this together. The 911 call came in just after 11 p.m. on a Tuesday night in October. The voice on the line was a man's, choked with a frantic, ragged hysteria that was all too familiar to the veteran dispatchers. "My wife," the man sobbed, his words tumbling over each other in a torrent of panicked grief. "Oh God, my wife. There's blood everywhere. I think she's dead." The address he gave was on a quiet, idyllic street in a prosperous, family-friendly suburb of Atlanta, a place of manicured lawns and two-car garages, a place where this kind of horror was not supposed to happen. The first patrol car arrived in under 3 minutes, its flashing blue and red lights a violent, silent intrusion into the peaceful, sleeping neighborhood. The front door of the handsome, 2-story colonial was wide open. The officers found David Washington in the foyer, on his knees, his body racked with the kind of deep, guttural sobs that seemed to be torn from the very center of his soul. He was a handsome, well-built man in his mid-30s, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated agony. He pointed, his hand trembling, towards the living room. "In there," he gasped. "I just got back. I was just getting milk." The officers found his wife, Maya Washington, on the floor by the fireplace. She was a woman who, even in the brutal finality of death, was clearly beautiful. But the scene was one of terrible, intimate violence. She had been killed by blunt force trauma, a crime of rage and fury. The room itself, however, was in a state of almost eerie perfection. Nothing was out of place. No furniture was overturned. A half-finished glass of wine sat on the coffee table. There were no signs of a struggle. Maya's purse, with her wallet and keys, was on the entryway table. The television was still on, its cheerful, mindless chatter a grotesque counterpoint to the silent, bloody tragedy on the floor. David Washington's performance was, in a word, masterful. He was the very picture of the devastated, grieving husband. He was cooperative but incoherent, his grief so overwhelming that he could barely form a complete sentence. He told the officers the same, simple story over and over again. He and Maya had put their 9-year-old daughter, Chloe, to bed around 9. They had watched some television. Around 10:30, he had realized they were out of milk for Chloe's breakfast in the morning. He had run out to the all-night convenience store. He said the trip took longer than usual, maybe 30 or 40 minutes, because the first store was closed for cleaning and he had to drive to another. When he had returned, he had found this. He had found his entire world shattered. It was a simple, plausible, and heartbreaking story. He even mentioned, between sobs, that the intruder must have taken his prized bowling trophy from the mantelpiece, the one thing of value he noticed missing. The initial assessment was clear. This was a home invasion gone terribly, tragically wrong. Detective Marcus Thorne arrived on the scene just before midnight. He was a veteran of the Atlanta Homicide Division, a man in his late 40s with a quiet, methodical demeanor and a deep, weary sadness in his eyes that came from 2 decades of standing in rooms just like this one. He took in the scene with a practiced, professional eye. He listened to the patrol officer's summary, noting the husband's alibi and the detail about the stolen trophy. He observed the victim, and then he observed the husband. He had seen 100 grieving husbands in his career. He had seen the real ones, and he had seen the ones who were acting. And David Washington, to his experienced eye, looked like the real thing. His grief was raw, visceral, and utterly convincing. Thorne felt a familiar, weary pang of sympathy. This poor man's life had just been destroyed. Thorne's first priority was the rest of the house. He knew there was a child, "Where's the daughter?" he asked one of the uniformed officers. "Upstairs," the officer replied. "We found her in her bedroom, hiding under her bed. She's not hurt, but she's not talking." Thorne took the stairs 2 at a time. The second floor of the house was as neat and as orderly as the first. He found the child's room, a place of soft pinks and stuffed animals. 2 officers were standing by the door, their expressions a mixture of professional detachment and human pity. Thorne knelt down and looked under the bed. And there, pressed against the wall in the deepest shadows, was a small, silent 9-year-old girl. Her name was Chloe. Her knees were drawn up to her chest, her arms wrapped around them in a tight, protective ball. Her eyes were wide, dark, and completely, utterly vacant. She was not crying. She was not speaking. She was simply gone, her mind having retreated to a place where the horrors of the real world could not reach her. Thorne, a father himself, felt his professional composure crack just for a moment. He had seen what violence did to bodies, but this was what it did to a soul. He knew, with a certainty born of long and bitter experience, that this little girl was the second victim of the monster who had come into her home tonight. Detective Marcus Thorne was a man who believed in patterns. Homicide, in his experience, was rarely a subtle or a creative crime. It was a crime of brutal, simple, and depressingly predictable motives: greed, jealousy, rage, and in 90% of the cases where a woman was found murdered in her own home, the killer was the man she shared it with. It was the first, hard, cynical rule of his profession. But as the investigation into the murder of Maya Washington moved into its first few days, the case refused to fit the pattern. David Washington, the grieving husband, was by all accounts a model citizen, a loving husband, and a doting father. And the crime scene itself was a maddening, frustrating contradiction. Thorne and his team worked the case with a methodical, painstaking diligence. They canvassed the neighborhood, but no one had seen or heard anything unusual. David himself had helpfully provided a potential lead, mentioning a dark-colored sedan he'd seen parked down the street when he left for the store, a car he didn't recognize. This tip, combined with his report of the stolen trophy, sent detectives on a frustrating, week-long search for a phantom burglar, pulling their immediate focus away from the husband. They began to dig into the life of the victim, Maya Washington. She was, by all accounts, a saint, a beloved and dedicated elementary school teacher, a woman without a single, known enemy in the world. There were no jilted lovers, no disgruntled parents, no hidden secrets. She was exactly what she appeared to be, a good woman who had been the victim of a terrible, inexplicable tragedy. The focus, inevitably, circled back to the husband. Thorne brought David Washington down to the station for a formal interview. He sat across from him in the small, gray, windowless room, and he watched him. David's grief was still palpable, but it was now overlaid with a quiet, dignified resolve. He was a man trying to hold himself together for the sake of his daughter. He answered every question with a calm, cooperative patience. He went over his timeline for the night of the murder again and again, his story never wavering. Thorne pushed him. He asked the hard, ugly questions. Were there problems in the marriage? Was there another woman? David's response was not anger or defensiveness, but a deep, wounded sadness. "Detective," he said, his voice thick with an emotion that seemed utterly genuine. "I loved my wife. She was my entire world. I know what you have to do. I know what you have to ask, but you are looking in the wrong place." And as Thorne looked into his clear, steady, grief-filled eyes, he was, for the first time in a long and cynical career, inclined to believe him. The man sitting across from him did not fit the pattern. He was not a killer. He was a victim. The investigation shifted its focus, moving away from the husband and back to the frustrating search for the phantom intruder. The forensic evidence from the scene was maddeningly unhelpful. There were no unidentified fingerprints, no foreign DNA, no stray fibers. The killer had been a ghost, leaving behind nothing but a dead body and a series of impossible unanswered questions. The case was a detective's nightmare, a perfect crime, a crime without a motive, without a witness, without a single tangible lead. The days turned into weeks, and the investigation, which had begun with a frantic, urgent intensity, began to slow, to stall, to lose its momentum. The murder of Maya Washington was in danger of becoming what Thorne dreaded most: a cold case, a thick, frustrating file in a drawer filled with other unsolved tragedies, a permanent, ugly stain on his professional record. He felt a growing sense of frustration, a feeling that he was missing something, that the answer was right in front of him, hiding in plain sight, but that he was simply unable or unwilling to see it. The silent, overlooked witness to the crime was, in the first, chaotic hours of the investigation, seen as little more than a tragic piece of collateral damage. 9-year-old Chloe Washington, found huddled and unresponsive in her bedroom, was a victim, not a source of information. The uniformed officers who found her, their hearts aching with a pity that was both professional and deeply human, had treated her with a gentle, careful deference. They had not questioned her. They had not pressed her for details. They had simply wrapped her in a warm blanket, carried her out of the house that had been transformed into a place of horror, and had waited for the arrival of the one person in the world who could now offer her a safe harbor. That person was Lena Abbott, Maya's younger sister. Lena arrived at the scene in a state of frantic, disbelieving shock, her mind struggling to process the impossible, nightmarish news she had received over the phone. She was a social worker by profession, a woman whose life was dedicated to navigating the complex, often heartbreaking world of family trauma. But the clinical, professional detachment of her job was a useless shield against the raw, personal agony of this moment. Her sister, her vibrant, laughing, beloved sister, was gone. And her niece, the quiet, bright, and deeply sensitive little girl she adored, was now an orphan, her life shattered in a single, violent, and incomprehensible act. When she saw Chloe, huddled in the back of a patrol car, her small body wrapped in a blanket, her eyes wide and vacant, Lena's own grief was momentarily eclipsed by a fierce, primal, protective instinct. She took Chloe into her arms. The little girl was rigid, unresponsive, her body a small, cold, and fragile thing. But Lena held on, whispering soft, soothing words, her own tears falling silently onto her niece's hair. In the days that followed, Chloe was handed over to Lena's official care. The police, including Detective Thorne, had been kind, but their interactions with Chloe had been brief. A child trauma specialist was brought in, but her initial assessment was conservative, warning that pushing the child to speak could do irreparable harm. David, in his role as the grieving father, had been adamant. "Leave her be," he had insisted to Thorne, his voice cracking with emotion. "She's been through enough. Don't you dare turn this tragedy into an interrogation for her." Out of sympathy and professional caution, the police had agreed to wait, officially classifying Chloe as a non-witness. They had no reason to believe she had seen or heard anything. The logical, if terrible, assumption was that the killer had entered the house after Chloe was already asleep in her bed and had been gone before she had ever woken up. Her silence was simply the natural, tragic result of a child who had woken up to find her mother gone and her world destroyed. So the investigation moved on without her. Chloe, and the secret she was carrying in the deep, locked, and silent chambers of her traumatized mind, was overlooked. She went to live with her Aunt Lena in a small, quiet house that was a world away from the place of her nightmares. She was surrounded by love, by patience, by a profound and gentle understanding, but she was also surrounded by a silence that was as deep and as absolute as her own. The adults in her life, the police, the doctors, her own family, all believed that she knew nothing. They were all wrong. She knew everything. She had seen it all, and the truth she was carrying was a terrible, crushing weight, a secret that was slowly, silently, destroying her from the inside out. The weeks following Maya Washington's murder settled into a grim, frustrating routine for Detective Marcus Thorne. The case, which had begun with a blaze of media attention and a sense of urgent, public outrage, was slowly, inexorably going cold. The phantom intruder, the faceless monster who had slipped into a quiet suburban home and had shattered a family, remained a ghost. Thorne and his team had chased down every conceivable lead, and every single one had dissolved into a dead end. They had investigated local sex offenders, recently paroled burglars, and every known violent criminal who operated within a 50-mile radius. They had found nothing. They had analyzed hours of security footage from nearby businesses, hoping to catch a glimpse of a suspicious vehicle or a person on foot on the night of the murder. They had found nothing. The forensic evidence, or the lack of it, was the most maddening part of the puzzle. The killer had been a ghost. There were no fingerprints, no footprints, no foreign DNA. It was as if he had simply materialized in the living room, committed the terrible act, and then had dematerialized, leaving behind only a dead body and a series of impossible, unanswered questions. The case was a perfect, seamless, and infuriating circle of frustration. Thorne found himself returning, again and again, to the husband. David Washington was the only person who didn't fit, precisely because he fit too perfectly. His grief was too perfect. His story was too simple. But Thorne had nothing. No evidence. No motive. No crack in the man's calm, cooperative, and heartbreakingly convincing facade. He was a grieving widower, a pillar of the community, a man who had the sympathy of the entire city. And Thorne, the jaded, cynical homicide detective, had to admit that he had the sympathy of him too. The case became a weight on Thorne's shoulders, a constant, low-level hum of failure in the back of his mind. He would lie awake at night, going over the details of the crime scene, the interviews, the dead-end leads, searching for the one, small, overlooked detail that would break the case open. He was a good detective, a man who believed in the power of methodical, patient police work. But this case was challenging his faith in the very system he had dedicated his life to. It was a reminder that sometimes, the truth was not a thing that could be found. Sometimes, it was a thing that could be lost, forever. While the police investigation was grinding to a halt, David Washington was, in the public eye, a man who was navigating an unimaginable tragedy with a quiet, heartbreaking grace. He was the perfect widower. He gave a eulogy at his wife's funeral that was a masterpiece of controlled, dignified grief, a speech that left the entire, packed church in tears. He spoke of Maya's warmth, her laughter, her boundless love for their daughter Chloe. He spoke of his own shattered heart, of the profound, unfillable void that her death had left in their lives. He was a man broken, but not defeated. A father who was determined to stay strong for the sake of his traumatized, silent child. The community rallied around him. Neighbors organized meal trains. The parents from Maya's school set up a college fund for Chloe. David, in a gesture of what seemed to be profound, selfless generosity, channeled his grief into action. He started a charitable foundation in his wife's name, Maya's Light, dedicated to supporting the families of victims of violent crime. He was on the local news, his handsome, grief-stricken face a symbol of resilience and grace in the face of terrible loss. He was, to the entire city of Atlanta, a man to be pitied, to be admired, a hero. But to one person, his performance was beginning to ring hollow. Lena Abbott, Maya's sister, was watching him, and in the small, private moments, away from the sympathetic gaze of the public, she was beginning to see the cracks in his perfect, grieving facade. She had taken Chloe into her home, and in the first few weeks, she had been too consumed by her own grief and by the immense, challenging task of caring for her traumatized niece to pay much attention to her brother-in-law. She had, like everyone else, seen his grief as genuine, but as the initial shock began to wear off, her social worker's instincts, her professional ability to read the subtle, unspoken cues of human behavior began to kick in. She noticed small, unsettling things. She noticed that David, in his conversations with her, seemed more concerned with the public perception of the tragedy than with the actual, slow, grinding work of the police investigation. He would talk about the success of the foundation, about the supportive articles in the newspaper, but he rarely, if ever, asked for updates on the search for his wife's killer. She noticed that when he came to visit Chloe, his interactions with the silent, withdrawn child were stilted, awkward, almost fearful. He seemed unable to connect with her, unable to offer her the simple, unconditional comfort that a grieving father should. He would hold her, but his embrace was stiff, his words of comfort sounding rehearsed, hollow. The final, decisive crack in her perception of him came during a conversation about Maya's life insurance. Lena was the executor of her sister's will. She remembered Maya telling her once, years ago when the will was drafted, about the standard life insurance policy she had through the teachers' union, naming Lena as co-beneficiary to ensure Chloe was cared for. When Lena mentioned this policy to David, his response was strange. He seemed to correct her, mentioning a much larger sum. When she questioned him, he became flustered, defensive, quickly changing the subject. It was a small moment, but for Lena, it was a blaring, discordant note in the perfect symphony of his grief. It was the first time she had seen him not as a victim, but as a man who was hiding something. A small, cold seed of suspicion was planted in her heart. She didn't know what he was hiding, but she knew, with a sudden, chilling certainty, that the man the world saw as the perfect widower was not the man he appeared to be. Detective Marcus Thorne, frustrated by the complete and total lack of external leads, decided, as a matter of final, procedural due diligence, to do one last, deep dive into the life of the husband. He did not expect to find anything. It was simply a matter of closing the loop on a case that was, for all intents and purposes, dead. He assigned a junior detective to the tedious task of pulling the complete financial records for both David and Maya Washington. What the rookie found was a bombshell. The Washingtons, to the outside world, were the very picture of upper-middle-class success. But their financial records told a different story. They were drowning in debt. David's contracting business was on the verge of collapse. He had a series of high-interest, unsecured loans from shady, online lenders. And, most damningly, he had a secret that took the form of regular, high-volume cash withdrawals, all made from ATMs in the vicinity of a well-known and notoriously illegal, high-stakes poker game. David Washington, the respectable businessman and doting father, had a serious and very expensive gambling problem, but it was the insurance paperwork that transformed the case from one of simple financial desperation to one of cold, premeditated murder. Maya Washington had a standard, modest life insurance policy through her teachers' union, the one Lena Abbott knew about. But the rookie detective, in a moment of inspired, diligent police work, had cross-referenced David's name with the state's central insurance database. And he had found it. A second policy. A massive $1 million policy taken out on Maya's life just 3 months before her murder. The policy had been taken out by David, and the signature on the application, the one that was supposed to be Maya's, was, according to a forensic handwriting expert, a very skillful but undeniable forgery. Thorne stared at the report on his desk, a cold, sickening feeling of professional shame washing over him. He had been played. David Washington's grief, his calm cooperation, his perfect, heartbreaking performance, it had all been a lie. A brilliant, sociopathic, and almost successful lie. He was not a grieving widower. He was a desperate, indebted gambler who had murdered his wife for $1 million payday. The motive, the one that had been so conspicuously absent, was now staring him in the face, as clear and as ugly as a fresh wound. He had been so focused on finding the monster who had come from outside that he had failed to see the monster who had been sitting right across from him, in his own interview room. He had broken the first, most cynical, and most reliable rule of his profession. He had believed the husband, and in doing so, he had almost let a killer get away with the perfect crime. The case was no longer cold, it was on fire. Thorne now had the motive. He had the means, a crime of blunt force trauma, a crime of rage. He had the opportunity, the tight window that now seemed not like an alibi, but like a piece of clever, careful planning. But he still had a problem. He had a powerful, circumstantial case, but he had no murder weapon. He had no direct evidence. He had nothing to physically tie David Washington to the crime. He had the why. He just didn't have the how. The final, crucial piece of the puzzle was still missing, and he had no idea that the only person in the world who could give it to him was a silent, traumatized, 9-year-old girl. Chloe Washington was living in a world of profound and suffocating silence. In the safe, quiet, and loving home of her Aunt Lena, she was physically cared for, but her mind was a locked and haunted room. She did not speak. She rarely made eye contact. She would spend hours in her new bedroom, sitting on the floor, not playing with her toys, but simply staring into a space that only she could see. The nights were the worst. The nightmares would come, terrible, fragmented flashes of sound and fury that would rip her from her sleep, her small body drenched in a cold sweat, a silent scream trapped in her throat. Lena would come to her, would hold her, would rock her back and forth, whispering soft, soothing words. But the terrors were a fortress that even her aunt's boundless love could not seem to penetrate. Lena, with her social worker's training, knew that the path to healing for a child who has experienced this level of trauma is a long, slow, and incredibly delicate one. She did not push Chloe to talk. She did not ask her questions about that night. She simply created a space of absolute, unconditional safety. She read to her. She played quiet games with her. She let the silence be, a shared, understood space between them. She knew that when Chloe was ready, if she was ever ready, she would find her own way to speak. The breakthrough, when it came, was not a dramatic, sudden revelation. It was a whisper in the dark. It was a few, fragmented, and utterly chilling words. One night, after a particularly bad nightmare, Lena was holding Chloe in her arms, humming a soft lullaby, the same one Maya used to sing to her. Chloe, her face buried in her aunt's shoulder, began to speak, her voice a small, terrified, and barely audible whisper. Mommy said the shouting was scaring me, she breathed, her small body trembling. Daddy was so loud. Lena froze, her blood turning to ice in her veins. She held her breath, her heart hammering in her chest. She did not ask a question. She did not react. She simply continued to hold her niece, to hum the soft, familiar tune, her mind a maelstrom of horror and a cold, terrible certainty. It was the first time Chloe had spoken of the night of the murder, and her words had not been about a monster or an intruder or a stranger. They had been about her father. In that moment, the small, nagging seed of suspicion that Lena had been carrying in her heart blossomed into a full-blown, terrifying conviction. David's strange behavior, his focus on his public image, his stilted interactions with his own daughter, it all snapped into a new, horrific focus. He was not a grieving widower, he was a killer. And his own daughter, his silent, traumatized 9-year-old daughter, was his only witness. Lena was now faced with a terrible, agonizing dilemma. She had to protect Chloe, but she also had to get justice for her sister. To push Chloe to remember, to force her to confront the full, monstrous truth of what she had seen, could be to re-traumatize her, to do a new and terrible violence to her already shattered psyche. But to remain silent, to let the secret stay buried in the darkness of her niece's mind, would be to let a murderer walk free. She chose a path of gentle, patient, and incredibly skillful care. She did not ask Chloe about her father. She did not ask her about the shouting. Instead, she began to use the tools of her trade. She began to engage Chloe in play therapy. She gave her a large pad of paper and a box of crayons. "Why don't you draw me a picture of your old house?" she suggested, her voice soft and casual. And as Chloe began to draw, to recreate the world that had been stolen from her, the locked doors of her memory began to slowly, painfully, creak open. The drawings were a child's raw, unfiltered, and terrifying testimony. They were not the happy, colorful pictures of a normal 9-year-old. They were dark, chaotic, and filled with a sense of profound, unspoken dread. She drew her mother, a smiling, beautiful figure, and then she would scribble over the figure with a black crayon, a violent, angry act of erasure. She drew her father, a large, looming figure with no face, his hands drawn as big, dark circles. And then, one afternoon, after days of this silent, crayon and paper therapy, she drew the living room. She drew the fireplace. She drew her mother, lying on the floor. And then, she drew her father, standing over her. And in his faceless hand, she drew a single, specific, and utterly damning object. It was a tall, shiny, golden trophy. Lena looked at the drawing, her heart aching with a mixture of horror and a grim, terrible triumph. She knew that trophy. It was David's prized possession, the trophy he had won for the City League Bowling Championship a few years earlier. It had always sat on the center of their living room mantelpiece, And she knew, from the police report that she had a copy of, that the trophy had been noted as missing from the crime scene. Chloe had not just been in the house. She had seen it. She had seen it all. And she had just drawn the murder weapon. The conversation with Detective Thorne was the most difficult and the most important of Lena Abbott's life. She sat in his small, cluttered office, the crayon drawing of the crime scene spread out on the desk between them. She told him everything. She told him about Chloe's nightmares, about the whispered words in the dark, about the slow, painful process of unlocking the child's memory through the gentle, non-threatening medium of play therapy. She told him about the bowling trophy. Thorne listened, his expression a mixture of deep, professional skepticism and a dawning, horrified respect. He was a man who had been trained to be wary of the testimony of children. He knew how fragile their memories could be, how easily they could be influenced, how the trauma of an event could warp and distort their perception of reality. "Ms. Abbott," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "I understand what you're saying, and I believe that you believe it. But you have to understand my position. You are a grieving family member. You are, by your own admission, suspicious of your brother-in-law. It is possible, it is even likely, that you are, with the best of intentions, unintentionally leading your niece, a deeply traumatized child, to a conclusion that fits your own suspicions." "I am not leading her," Lena shot back, her voice sharp with a fierce, protective anger. "I am listening to her. There is a difference, Detective. A difference you and your department have ignored from the very beginning." She pointed to the drawing. "That trophy. You know it's missing, don't you? It was in your initial report, but you never released that detail to the public. There is no way Chloe could have known that, unless she saw it. There is no way I could have known it, unless she told me." Thorne stared at the drawing. She was right. The missing bowling trophy was a key, non-public detail of the crime scene. It was the kind of specific, verifiable fact that could corroborate a witness's testimony. His professional skepticism began to war with the cold, hard logic of the evidence in front of him. He had been so sure that the child had seen nothing. He had been so convinced by the father's perfect, grieving performance. But what if he had been wrong? What if the truth had been there, all along, locked away in the silent, terrified mind of a 9-year-old girl? It was Chloe herself who provided the final, irrefutable piece of the puzzle. Lena, knowing that she needed more than just a drawing, had continued her gentle, patient work with her niece. And Chloe, feeling safer, feeling heard, had finally begun to speak, to fill in the terrible, silent spaces of her memory. She told Lena, in a small, quiet and unwavering voice, what had happened after her mother had fallen down. Frightened by the shouting, she had crept out of her room to the top of the stairs, peeking through the banister. After she saw her mother on the floor, she watched in terror as her father took the trophy. When he walked out of the living room, she silently followed him, hiding in the shadows of the hallway as he went into the garage. From there, she saw him hide it. "Where did he hide it, sweetie?" Lena had asked, her voice barely a whisper, and Chloe's answer was a single, devastatingly specific and utterly convincing detail. "In his dirty work boot," she said. "The one in the big gray metal cabinet. He put it inside his boot." Lena relayed this final, crucial detail to Thorne. And in that moment, all of his skepticism, all of his professional doubt, vanished, replaced by a cold, hard, and absolute certainty. He was looking at the truth. A child's memory, especially a traumatized child's memory, could be a confusing, fragmented thing, but it could also be a place of pure, unvarnished, and photographic clarity. The detail of the work boot, of the specific hiding place, was not something a child would invent. It was not something an adult could plant. It was the truth. It was the key. He had his witness, and now he was going to get his killer. The search warrant was executed with a quiet, grim efficiency. Detective Thorne and his team descended on David Washington's perfect, suburban home, not as sympathetic investigators, but as the agents of a justice that was long overdue. David was not home. He was at a luncheon for his charitable foundation, accepting an award for his courage and resilience in the face of unspeakable tragedy. Thorne took a grim professional satisfaction in the timing, The perfect widower's world was about to come crashing down around him. Thorne went straight to the garage. It was neat, orderly, the very picture of suburban competence. And against the far wall, just as Chloe had described, was a large, gray, metal storage cabinet. Thorne opened it. Inside were shelves of tools, of paint cans, of all the mundane paraphernalia of home ownership, and on the bottom shelf was a pair of old, mud-caked work boots. Thorne reached into the right boot, and his fingers closed around the cold, hard, and unmistakable shape of a bowling trophy. He pulled it out. It was heavy, solid, the base made of a thick, polished marble. It had been wiped clean, its golden surface gleaming under the harsh fluorescent light of the garage. It was, to a casual observer, just a trophy. But Thorne knew it was the murder weapon. He handed it to the forensic technician with a single, quiet order. Bag it, and get it to the lab, now. While the search of the house was underway, another team of detectives was executing a second warrant. This one for the secret storage unit that the financial investigation had uncovered. What they found there was a testament to David Washington's secret life. The unit was filled with expensive, high-end electronics, with designer clothes, with all the trappings of a life of wealth and success that was a complete and total fiction. And in a locked briefcase, they found the paperwork for the forged $1 million life insurance policy on his wife. The case was no longer circumstantial. It was a fortress of evidence. The call came from the forensic lab a few hours later. The trophy had been meticulously cleaned, but the lab's technicians were experts in finding the ghosts of evidence. Using a specialized chemical agent and a high-powered microscope, they had found what they were looking for. In the tiny, microscopic crevices of the engraving at the base of the trophy, they had found them. A few, microscopic and undeniable traces of blood, and the DNA from that blood was a perfect match for Maya Washington. They had also been able to lift a partial, latent fingerprint from the smooth, curved surface of the bowling ball at the top of the trophy. A fingerprint that was a perfect match for David Washington. They had it all. The motive, the weapon, the forensic link. And at the heart of it all, they had the quiet, unwavering, and incredibly brave testimony of a 9-year-old girl. Detective Thorne went himself to the luncheon to make the arrest. He walked into the crowded, cheerful ballroom, past the tables of the city's elite, and he approached the podium where David Washington was in the middle of a humble, heartfelt speech about his beloved, murdered wife. Thorne did not wait for him to finish. He walked up onto the stage, took the microphone from David's hand, and said, in a voice that was cold, clear, and filled with the authority of the law, "David Washington, you are under arrest for the murder of your wife." The ballroom erupted in a collective, disbelieving gasp. The perfect widower's mask finally, and completely, shattered, his face a mixture of pure, shocked disbelief and the cold, dawning horror of a man who had just been caught. The monster was no longer hiding. He was exposed, in the full, unforgiving glare of the public spotlight. The arrest of David Washington sent a shockwave of disbelief and horror through the city of Atlanta. The story of the beloved, grieving husband who was now accused of being a cold-blooded killer was a media sensation. But as the details of the investigation began to leak out, the focus of the story shifted. It was no longer just about the fall of a respected community figure. It was about the incredible, unbelievable story of the 9-year-old girl who had brought him down. Chloe Washington, the silent, traumatized child who had been overlooked and forgotten, was now the star witness in the city's most high-profile murder case. The case was assigned to Assistant District Attorney Simone Jones. Simone was one of the top prosecutors in the Fulton County DA's office, a woman in her late 30s with a sharp, incisive legal mind and a deep, empathetic understanding of the victims she represented. She knew, from the moment she read the file, that this would be the most challenging and the most important case of her career. The forensic evidence was strong. The financial motive was clear, but she knew that the heart of her case, the thing that would either convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt or allow a clever defense attorney to plant the seeds of doubt, was Chloe. Her entire case rested on the fragile, traumatized shoulders of a 9-year-old girl, and David Washington's defense attorney, a high-priced, notoriously aggressive lawyer named a man who specialized in turning victims into villains, knew it too. His strategy became immediately, brutally clear. He would not try to refute the financial evidence. He would not try to explain away the trophy. He would attack the child. He filed a barrage of pre-trial motions, all aimed at a single goal: to have Chloe's testimony declared inadmissible. He argued that she was a deeply traumatized child, that her memory was unreliable, that she had been manipulated and coached by her vengeful and clearly biased aunt. He painted a picture of a little girl who had been so broken by her mother's death that she had created a fantasy, a false memory, to make sense of an incomprehensible tragedy. He was, in effect, trying to put Chloe herself on trial. Simone Jones fought back with a fierce, protective tenacity. She knew that the key to winning this fight was not just to prove that Chloe was a credible witness, but to ensure that the process of testifying did not inflict a new and terrible trauma on the child. She brought in a team of child psychologists and victims advocates. They worked with Chloe for weeks, not to rehearse her testimony, but to create a safe, supportive, and empowering environment for her to tell her own story in her own words. They used therapy dolls to help her reenact the events. They had her draw pictures. They taught her simple, calming breathing exercises to use if she felt overwhelmed. They prepared her, not as a witness, but as a survivor who was about to perform the bravest act of her young life. The pre-trial hearings were a brutal, grueling battle. The defense attorney was relentless, using every legal trick and psychological tactic at his disposal to discredit the child. But Simone was equally relentless. She presented the expert testimony of the child psychologists. She presented the evidence of Chloe's drawings, of the specific, non-public details she had provided that had led the police to the murder weapon. She argued, with a passionate, eloquent force, that to deny this child the right to speak, to silence the only witness to a terrible crime, would be a profound and unforgivable miscarriage of justice. In the end, the judge, a wise and experienced woman who had seen the very worst of what human beings could do to each other, made her ruling. Chloe Washington would be allowed to testify. The jury would be allowed to hear her story, and they would be the ones to decide if it was the truth. It was a major victory for the prosecution, but it was a victory that came with a heavy, terrifying weight. Simone had won the right for Chloe to speak. Now she had to pray that this small, fragile, and incredibly brave little girl could withstand the full, brutal force of a public trial and a merciless cross-examination. The fight for justice for Maya Washington was about to enter its final, most difficult, and most public stage. The courtroom was a place of hushed, tense, and almost unbearable anticipation. Every seat was filled. The media, the public, the families of both Maya and David Washington, they were all here to witness the final, dramatic act of this suburban tragedy. David Washington sat at the defense table, his handsome face a mask of calm, confident innocence. He looked not like a man on trial for murder, but like a man who was patiently waiting for this terrible, unfortunate misunderstanding to be cleared up. But the real center of the courtroom's attention was the small, empty chair on the witness stand. When the bailiff called her name, a profound silence fell over the room. Chloe Washington walked into the courtroom, holding her Aunt Lena's hand. She was a small, fragile figure in a simple, pale blue dress, her hair in two neat braids. She looked like what she was, a 9-year-old girl who should have been in a classroom or on a playground, not here, in this cold, intimidating, and very adult world of law and justice. She climbed into the large, oversized witness chair, her small feet dangling a few inches above the floor. She looked out at the sea of faces, at the judge in her black robes, at the 12 strangers in the jury box who held her father's fate in their hands. And then, her eyes met her father's. David gave her a small, sad, and encouraging smile. The smile of a loving father who was proud of his brave little girl. It was a piece of theater so chilling, so audacious, that it made the blood in Simone Jones's veins run cold. Simone began her direct examination, her voice soft, gentle, and reassuring. She did not ask Chloe about the murder. She asked her about her mother. She asked her to describe her favorite things to do with her mom, the songs her mom used to sing to her, the smell of the pancakes her mom used to make on Saturday mornings. She was not just questioning a witness, she was painting a picture for the jury. A picture of the vibrant, loving, and irreplaceable woman who had been stolen from this child. And as Chloe spoke, her voice a small, quiet, but clear and steady thing, the ghost of Maya Washington filled the courtroom, her presence a powerful, silent testament to the magnitude of the crime. Then, Simone gently, carefully, guided Chloe to the night of the murder. And Chloe, in her own simple, direct and unadorned words, told the jury what she had seen. She told them about the shouting that woke her up. She told them about creeping to the top of the stairs and seeing her mother fall. Then, her voice dropping to a near whisper, she told them about following her father as he carried the shiny trophy, and watching from the hallway door as he went into the garage to hide it. Simone knew the circumstantial case was strong, but Chloe's testimony was the final crucial link. As she would later argue to the jury, without Chloe the case would have been circumstantial. With her, it became airtight. Simone asked her the final, terrible question. "Chloe," she said, her voice filled with a compassion that was both professional and deeply human, "who was it that hurt your mommy?" Chloe looked at her father. The sad, encouraging smile was gone from his face, replaced by a look of cold, hard, and menacing intensity. It was a look that was meant to silence her, to remind her of his power, of her fear. But Chloe did not look away. She held his gaze, and in her quiet 9-year-old eyes, there was a strength that was more powerful than all of his rage and all of his lies. She turned her face to the jury, and she said, in a voice that was as clear and as true as a bell, "It was my dad." The cross-examination was as brutal as Simone had feared. The defense attorney approached the child with a kind of predatory, theatrical sympathy. He tried to twist her words, to confuse her timeline, to plant the seeds of doubt. He suggested that she had been asleep, that she had had a bad dream. He suggested that her Aunt Lena, who hated her father, had filled her head with these terrible, false stories. But Chloe did not break. She did not get confused. She did not cry. She simply answered every question with the same, simple, and unshakable honesty. "No," she would say, her voice quiet but firm. "That's not what happened." "No," she would repeat. "I was awake. I saw it." She was a rock, a small, immovable island of truth in a sea of legal maneuvering and cynical lies. Her testimony was not the confused, fragmented story of a traumatized child. It was the clear, coherent, and utterly devastating account of the only witness to a murder. And everyone in that courtroom, from the judge to the jury to the reporters in the back row, knew that they were listening to the truth. The jury was out for less than 2 hours. The verdict was a formality, a simple, legal confirmation of the truth that everyone in the courtroom had seen in the eyes of a brave, 9-year-old girl. When the foreman stood and said the word "guilty," a collective, cathartic gasp of relief swept through the room. David Washington's mask of calm, confident innocence finally, and completely, shattered. His face contorted in a mask of pure, narcissistic rage, and he began to shout, to curse, to proclaim his innocence. A final, pathetic, and utterly unconvincing performance. But no one was listening to him anymore. All eyes were on the small, silent girl in the pale blue dress, who was now safely in the arms of her Aunt Lena. Her small body finally, after all this time, shaking with the tears of a grief that she was now, finally, free to feel. The final scene of the story did not take place in a courtroom or a police station or any of the cold, official places that had defined the past year of their lives. It took place in a backyard, on a warm, sun-drenched afternoon in the spring. Chloe and her Aunt Lena were on their knees in the soft, dark earth, their hands covered in dirt. They were planting a garden, a memorial garden, for Maya. It was Chloe's idea. She wanted to create a place of beauty, a place of life, a place where she could come and feel close to the mother she had lost. They worked together, in a comfortable, easy silence, planting the flowers that Maya had loved most, bright, cheerful sunflowers, fragrant lavender, and deep, velvety red roses. As they worked, a genuine, unforced smile began to spread across Chloe's face. It was a smile that had been absent for a very long time. A smile that was a testament to the incredible, resilient, and life-affirming power of a child's spirit. The scar of what she had been through would never fully fade. The memory of that terrible night would always be a part of her, but it would no longer define her. She was not just the girl who had witnessed a murder. She was not just the girl who had put her own father in prison. She was a survivor. She was a gardener. She was a child, finally, truly, and safely, at home. Lena watched her, her heart filled with a mixture of a deep, aching sorrow for the sister she had lost, and an immense, overwhelming sense of pride and love for the niece she had helped to save. The journey had been a long, dark, and incredibly difficult one, but they had made it. They had walked through the fire, and they had come out on the other side. Together, justice had been served. A monster was in a cage, and a garden was being planted. It was not a perfect ending. There was no such thing. But it was an ending filled with hope, an ending filled with the promise of new life, of new growth, of the quiet, unshakable certainty that even after the darkest, most terrible of nights, the sun will, in the end, always rise again.